Hey, what's going on, everybody out there? My name is Drake, and this is the Drake Martinez podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. And today is Saturday, March 16th. It's a beautiful Saturday here in California, sunny California. And wherever you may be, I hope you are having a blessed Saturday. Without any further ado, we're going to be getting into today's content and today's topic, which is about Oppenheimer. So, Oppenheimer won a lot of Oscars. I'm pretty sure they're called Oscars or Golden Globes or whatever. It got a lot of awards. Whatever those awards are, it got a lot of them. And, a lot of people love this film. And I saw, like, some of it. It got to a certain point in the film where I was just like, I'm going home. I don't want to watch this anymore. But what Oppenheimer does reveal is that there was a concerted effort and actually a great deal of sophistication within the KGB in terms of their intelligence gathering operations and their capabilities. So, for those of you who are paying attention, the whole premise of why Oppenheimer was so, I guess, controversial in terms of like how like the army was looking at him and how the U.S. government was looking at him is, yes, he was brilliant in terms of like his abilities in physics and knowing the community and like running programs such as that. But he was a communist and he had a lot of communist friends, and it's actually pretty similar if you think about it today, where the elite, our intellectual and educational elite, tend to have really leftist leaning politics, and which differ quite considerably from people who work primarily in, like, for example, the military or business, that they have like almost like polar opposite terms of like political perspectives. So it wasn't really that much different during the 40s and the 30s and the 20s, actually, if you go back that far. Even like presidents like Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a lot of the intellectual and like social elites from that time period were just as communist and left-leaning as they are today. Now, maybe not so much in terms of like social policies, but certainly in terms of like political and government policies back then. And actually back then they had quite a few policies that were something that we would consider horrible today. Like, case in point would be eugenics. Eugenics was very, very popular amongst social elites back during the 1920s and 1930s, 40s, 50s, all the way through the 60s. And eugenics was essentially what perpetuated and was like sort of like this underlying idea behind Nazism, which was this whole idea that of superior races, that this could all be proven through eugenics and studying genes. And very sophisticated, or not sophisticated, but it wasn't like a hillbilly type of like racism. It was, their whole perspective was based on science and based on crap science. Actually, it was just the way that they do this now with like global warming and climate change and whatnot, that they use really bad science to perpetuate their own ideas, and they do it in the name of science, but their science is flawed. Just the same way that this happens with like transgenderism, where it's like, oh, well, the science shows that there is a significant difference between gender and sex, where they don't really show you as much as you need to know about like how that is just junk science when you really look into it. That's not the topic for today, but it's showing you this overarching tendency that elites have when pointing to science to argue their point, and point to science to discredit points that refute their points, if that makes sense. So climate change is one of them. Transgenderism is another one. And eugenics during this time period was their way of proving, like, or their way of saying, the science proves that, we're a superior race. This goes to people, even the people that started modern, the modern day Planned Parenthood movement. And, their objective was, this is well-established facts that their objective was to reduce the black population in urban cities. So people like Margaret Sanger, that was the eugenics movement. That was the Democratic Party operating in the cities, attempting to, or not attempting, they factually and indeed did decrease populations of black people living in inner cities by implementing Planned Parenthood and advertising abortion as a method to do that. So eugenics was a very sophisticated movement based off of junk science that, perpetuated this racist idea, truly racist idea of superiority from race to race. And of course, that was exactly what German socialism, i.e. Nazism, used as its foundation in order to perpetuate its own ideas throughout Germany and its conquering areas. So what Oppenheimer shows is this intellectual elite that we had in the United States during that time was really keen on socialism, not just socialism, but communism, and was very lenient towards and interacting with the KGB and the Soviet Union. And when you take a look at Oppenheimer, the general that's played by Matt Damon is really concerned about the amount of exposure and the amount of contact that he has with these groups, because one, he was educated in that area, and socialism was really popular in Europe during that time. And what it goes to show is that there was not just the social elite in the United States that were so keen on this idea, but also how immensely sophisticated the KGB was. And this is actually really surprising if you really think about it, because up until, I want to say, World War I, the premier espionage and intelligence gathering agencies were all concentrated in actually Great Britain during the time. And a lot of this has to do with the history of what they call like the Venetian period, where Venice was a state that primarily focused on utilizing espionage and intelligence gathering to control neighboring states. And a lot of those people fled to the island of Great Britain when, if you look in history for like the Venetian War. So because a lot of the states within Europe became really like upset with the Venetians for utilizing this really like underhanded kind of method in order to control its neighboring states. For example, like using like blackmail, that sort of those sorts of like underhanded, like dirty techniques. So the states throughout Europe got together and destroyed Venice, and the Venetians left and went to Great Britain. So a lot of people associate the sudden and immense growth that the British espionage and intelligence gathering techniques with that move from those who left Venice to going into Great Britain. And for a number of years, Britain was the premier place in terms of like being able to utilize espionage and intelligence gathering techniques. But it doesn't really make it very there's not a lot of historical evidence that, at least that I can find. Maybe for those of you who do know about it, can share in the comments or point to different resources that will illustrate how the Russians were able to really improve their intelligence gathering and espionage techniques to the point that the United States was actually really worried about it. And this is almost immediate, that as soon as the Soviet Union becomes the Soviet Union, it already has people implanted in Great Britain. By people, I mean agents, implanted in Great Britain and the United States. And this was a concern in World War II. So almost immediately, within 13, 14 years, the Soviet Union goes from a brand new state to having such a sophisticated espionage and intelligence gathering network that they had already had agents working in deep, not just in, but deep inside the United States government and the British government. So and And this is well-established historical fact. You can look at people like mainline historians like John Lewis Gaddis talk about this, where he goes into great detail about in his Cold War account of how the United States and the Soviet Union have this tumultuous period in which they're first coming out of the Cold War, first coming into the Cold War out of World War II, and there was already this network of KGB operatives that were operating in the United States government. That a lot of the secrets that were closely held all the way up to the presidency, like in his inner circle, were well known by the Soviets. So they know now, based off of those historical records, that even way back to like 1943, 1942, that the KGB had infiltrated the highest levels of the United States government, and also the British. And again, that's really surprising when you go back to consider just how sophisticated the British were, going back into, I think it's probably like the 15th century. So very, very surprising to come to these facts. And Oppenheimer, as we're getting into today's episode, really illustrates that fact, but they don't really that's not the main focus, but it just shows like how well known this historical fact was. So why are we talking about this today in 2024? Well, what a lot of people don't know is that the KGB not only had such an influence in the United States government during that time, but this influence expanded and really permeated going into what they call like the Red Scare, which was led by the Senator McCarthy. So a lot of people will call it the Red Scare, but what's actually going on when you look at released documents, like the Verona Project, is that a lot of people in the Senate were actually compromised by the KGB. And people within the Congress, people within media, and the highest levels of government were compromised, in fact, by the KGB. So the KGB utilized very sophisticated techniques that were not just overt, but a lot of it was designed to work in terms of like generational decay. So there's a former KGB operative that I think if a lot of you are unfamiliar with this concept, you can go back and you search on YouTube. There's a former KGB operative by the name of Yuri Brezmenov, and he talks at length about KGB tactics that were utilized not just in the United States, but Canada, which he eventually defected to, Britain, and then his number one place that he operated in was India. So throughout the world, KGB operatives were dispersed, utilizing what we now know as their consulates and via their embassies, in order to subvert and erode the culture that they were attached to. For example, let's say you have a KGB operative that is sent to India, and he works with the local government. Those operatives work with the local government to promote communism, to promote social and cultural measures that will, what they call like active measures, will over generation deteriorate the national culture and replace it with one that is of communism, socialism. And this happened all around the world. This wasn't just like a project that was limited to like one or two countries. This was all around the world. The KGB operated this way. And in the United States in particular, like if you went to an embassy that was run by the Soviet Union, pretty much everyone in there was working for the KGB. And they had infiltrated many different embassies, and like I said, different entertainment industries, various aspects of government. And then you can see this cultural and social change that continuously went on throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then all the way up to the fall of the Soviet Union. Obviously, the KGB is not around anymore. It was replaced by the GRU. And so Russia isn't really like, they have a different mission. It's not like exactly the same as it was during the KGB, but that level of sophistication that those intelligence agencies have, obviously maintains itself, but it has a different mission. It's not exactly like promoting communism, if that makes sense. But in other words, the damage was already done. By the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, the KGB had already implemented so many of these different techniques over generations that you can start to see today those changes that KGB operatives like Yuri Bezmenov described, that they knew going back into the 60s that, hey, you know what, this might not happen right away, but over time, we would eventually see the countries revert to communism, if that makes sense. So, like, even one of the well-known KGB operatives that we now know about was that guy that was like pushing, I think it was like LSD. His name, I forgot his name, is like O'Leary, something like that. Leary, Dennis Leary, or no, Dennis Leary was a comedian. Something Leary, Timothy Leary. There we go. He was working with the KGB that we now know, and his major claim to fame during the 70s, during the Vietnam War, was like drop in and tune out, meaning like drop some acid and tune out of the war. Like, don't even think about it. It's not something that you need to be concerned about. Just be concerned about yourself. Take some drugs. Everything's going to be great. You don't have to worry about any of that kind of stuff. All you need to worry about is, your own like self-development through drugs, through the drug culture that came to be during the 70s. So, again, you can see, and then a lot of these documents from the Verona Project reveal just how many people were on the KGB payroll, either actively or through what they call like subversive or active measures from the KGB operatives that were working with them. So it was very sophisticated. It was very ubiquitous. It was all around the world that the KGB operatives had this method down to a T. And then we do have some documentation from operatives that did defect to the West that show exactly how they were able to do it and the scale of their operations. So, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think it was something to the effect of like 80% of what the KGB was doing was active measures by trying to infiltrate, infiltrating and subverting the host countries and their cultures and their social fabric to replace it over time with communism. And again, this is very much evident in Oppenheimer, and you can see how it at first affects the social and educational elite in a country because they're the ones that are going to be having contact. But over time, you can see how this trickles down into the education system. And then once it's in the colleges and the universities, then it starts to become absorbed into the mainstream culture. And once it's absorbed into the mainstream culture, and that's when you start seeing these radical changes that we've seen in the United States in the last like 30 years, for example, with like really aggressive third wave feminism, with transgenderism, massive expansion in terms of like LGBTQ, whatever other letters that they added on, all of these sorts of mentalities and movements weren't really mainstream until about the 1990s, going into the 2000s, and then really started coming into a major effect in the 2010 era, pretty much as soon as like Obama became president. So, and the reason why communism is it's such a pervasive like ideology, not just because of like the lack of like individual freedom that is associated with it, but it's an all-encompassing economic, political, and military system. It's a way of life that doesn't allow for flexibility in any aspect. So one really good example of this is actually if you take a look at in the Soviet history, where again we're going back to this idea of like how they use science to shut down people's ideas and in the name of science, if that makes sense. So like a perfect example would be transgenderism, that the left will push this idea of, well, you don't believe in science, you're a science denier, right? They use that argument for vaccines. Like, oh, you don't want this vaccine that we're going to shove down your throat? You're a science denier. Or you don't believe in climate change? You're a science denier. But basic science shows that there's X and X chromosomes for a woman, and there's an XY chromosome for a man. But somehow that is, that science is too much for them. They're like, yeah, you know what? The science doesn't really prove that. I don't believe in that kind of science. My science shows something else. Well, there's a very well-known historical aspect of this that was used in the Soviet Union that ended up killing about 6 million people, and it was called Lysenkoism. Now, Lysenkoism was this idea that the Soviets didn't like the fact of, or not the fact, they didn't like the scientific usage of things like natural selection, or, like, so for example, like Darwin. So this idea of like using of like crossbreeding plants in order to create like, your more your plants that are more sturdy in times of like winter, which, for winter harvest, like they have in the Soviet Union, or right now Russia, but back then in the Soviet Union, they had there was a series of farmers that were like trying to utilize different plants and seeds to create the strongest crop. And the Russian government, or back then the Soviet Union government, thought, well, this is too much like, this thought process is too similar to Darwinism, which is too similar to natural selection, which reminds us too much of this idea of capitalism. So because capitalism is like, hey, let the market decide, who are the strongest competitors, and the strongest competitors will survive in the market, right? So they're like, oh, this sounds a little too much like capitalism nonsense. So we don't want you using those types of seeds. We want you to use a different type of farming method that was developed by Lysenko, this, Soviet, like farmer scientist, like agricultural scientist. And that method led to the deaths of millions of people due to the famine. So you can see, like, when you have this like rigid mindset and like this association of like, well, that sounds too much like this. A lot of people will do that with Trump. Another good example, it was like, which is actually really ironic that this happened this week. It's really sad, but there was that period of time when, the media was saying like, oh, Trump is such a jerk for saying that Haiti was a S-hole. He was basically saying like, Haiti's a failed state. I don't know why we're taking in so many people from Haiti. Like, why do we need more people from Haiti when it's a failed government? It's a failed state. And people around the media were like, what does he mean it's a failed state? It doesn't have Trump as the president. It's such a great place, But just this week we've seen, that unfortunately that the Haitian government fell again, and it's taken over by some guy named Barbecue. And there's new waves of people coming in from Haiti in order to escape the violence and the chaos that's undertaken that area. Well, with that, I'll probably start wrapping it up, but I wanted to just do a little podcast today, an episode about, this idea of just how strong and how much the KGB was able to infiltrate and influence different agencies all around the globe during the time of the Cold War, and the damage that they caused. And I highly encourage any of my listeners, people out there that want to learn more about it. There's a really great book called History of the Cold War by John Lewis Gaddis, and he basically gives a straight down the line account of all the major events of the Cold War, with a lot of cause and effect of like what led up to what, and from different perspectives, and then also from the point of view from the United States government and also from the Soviet Union. But there's just so many stark contrasts between the different points of view for example, from like communism and capitalism, the Western liberalism versus, authoritarianism in the communist state. And then I thought one example was really interesting when he starts mentioning in the book the Berlin Wall and all the politics that went into erecting the Berlin Wall, that the Soviets were really against building the Berlin Wall, but they ultimately had no choice because they were losing millions of people by the week. There was, at one point, millions of people pouring across the border, kind of sounds like today, going from East Germany to West Germany. In other words, leaving a failed state, communism, which is largely what the South American governments and the Central American governments have all been using, and going to capitalism and Western liberalism, and going to an operating and successful state. So what Khrushchev at the time was like, hey, you know what? I don't want us to put up a wall. I don't want us to put up the Berlin Wall over there. I want you guys to increase the standard of living in East Germany. And the East Germans were like, we really can't do that under our operating system, and we can't compete with Western Germany. We can't compete with them. And then eventually they came to the decision to build the wall. And if you look at photos from the Berlin Wall, one side is heavily armed, not just to keep people, but only to keep people in, not keep people out. And then the other side has graffiti. So in other words, on the eastern side of the wall, the East Germans were not allowed to go anywhere near the wall. If they were, they'd be shot. So the wall is pristine. There's no graffiti. There's nothing on it. Just armed guards. And on the other side, the West Germans can walk right up to the wall, touch it, spray paint, put some art on there, and do whatever they like. And none of them were forced to be kept inside. And I think the Berlin Wall, that difference tells you everything you need to know about a successful state versus a unsuccessful state, a failed state. And unfortunately, we saw that again this week with Haiti. Okay, so with that, I'll leave you guys, and I got some new stuff coming up next week. I'll probably comment on some new things that are happening in the news. We also had this for those of you in California. We also had this whole debate going on of what's going to happen with Proposition 1, and right now it's so close that I think the difference was only like 19,000 votes. It was like 2.2 million on each side for yes and no, and with a difference of like 19,000, which is not a lot. And initially I was really sad when I read the news because, anything that's being pushed by Gavin Newsom is not going to be good, and he really wants this proposition to pass. But on the other side, I was actually kind of happy because it really shows that since it was so close, that I think a lot of people in California are waking up to the fact that, this style of government is what's going to lead to a failed state like Haiti, like East Germany, like the Soviet Union, that they can only really be able to perpetuate themselves with propaganda, subversion, and, those kind of like underhanded tactics. So, all right, with that, I'll leave you guys, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your weekend, and we'll see you guys next week.